Ordinarily, React applications are structured in a hierarchical order. Now, what this means is React is structured in a way that for data to be shared, like we did in props, we saw how two components can share data. For data to be shared among these components, it can only be shared between the parent component and the child component. Okay, let's make use of a more practical example, because let me be honest with you, this is not such an easy course, and I want you to learn this topic. If you learn and master this topic, I promise you, you should beat your chest and call yourself a React developer, because from here, I don't think there is anything you are going to encounter in React that you will not be able to resolve. Assuming there's a restaurant anywhere in the world where you pick a number and then you sit in the queue according to your number, and when you make an order, your food have to be passed to the number one guy, and the number one guy passes the food to number two, and the number two guy passes the food to number three, then the number three passes the food to number four before it now gets to you. Right? Now imagine when you are number 100. You understand that this is not an efficient way to run a restaurant, right? And I'm not sure you would want to go there. Now, that is the kind of system React runs. Okay, so every time a component requests for a need, that need can only be passed between the component and its parent component through props. This is to say that content sharing is a little bit difficult in React, and this is where Context API comes in. What Context API does is that it builds a central system where all the components that want to make use of data can pass their request to. So that means if all the functions we need to share, if every state we need to share among all these components is stored in a particular central system, and from that central system, every other component can make their request to this system, to this central system, and this central system answers them. So that is more like where you have an efficient restaurant this time, where when you come into the restaurant, you make your request. Just go straight to the counter and make your request, and then you get served directly without having to pass through anybody. You would agree with me that this is a more efficient way to get things done. That is what Context API does for us. So every time you're about to get confused, oh, what am I doing? Think of that restaurant, that you are simply trying to ensure that all your components have access to everything, to every shareable data and information in your application. Now, to demonstrate this, we are going to build a simple to-do application. What this application does is, when we open this application, we enter the things we want to do for the day, and anyone we do, we either mark it or we delete. We take that one of the application. Right, so let's get straight into it. In my app.js file, we have two components here, to-do and to-do list. I might as well change this to-do to to-do inputs, right? And then I'll call it to-do input here, so we should be able to know what we're doing. So I have to-do inputs and to-do lists. So these are the two components I have in my app.js, and this is to-do inputs, the text box and the button, and here is my to-do list. All right, so these two components are represented right here. Okay, so let's open the individual components and see what we have there. So I created a folder. I made a folder to do, and that folder contains this component here, to do input, containing just my to do text box and the button, and then I have the to do item, and each item contains my to do, or let me call it to do item. So we have a component here called to do list, and this to do list just contains just the component to do item, right? This component imported here, and this component rendered here, to do item. That is all it contains. So we are going to use Context API to handle this. So the first thing I need to do right here, it's not a must, but to make things clearer, I want to create a folder, and I'll call that folder context. All right, and in this folder, I'm going to create a component. I will call it context component. .js. This context component is going to contain something, right? And all I need to do here is I need to say import create context from React, right? And the next thing I need to do, we need to initialize that create context. So we have to say create a variable context. Let's call it this variable context composition. Okay, let me call it my context, right? Let me call it my context, capital letter please. Okay, let's call it to do context. All right, to do context equal to create context, right? So we have imported create context from React, and now we created a variable called to the context, so that every time we want to make use of all of the features that this guy has, we are going to use this to access all those features that this guy has. So we say const to do context equal to create context. All right, so the next thing we need to do is we need to export this. Okay, so we need to export default context to do context, because in order to use it we need to export it. So now that we have exported it, right, now that we have exported it, let us create another component and let's call it to do state. Now there are different ways of doing this, right? The method I'm using right now is the method I recommend for myself, which I also recommend for you because it puts everything for you in perspective. Some people might want to put everything inside this same file. All right, I don't encourage that. All right, so I created another component called another file called to do state.js. So let me call this. Let me change the name of this file. Let me call this one to do component, right? Sorry, call this one to do component, to do context. Sorry, yeah. So the next thing I need to do right now is we create this. All right, so let's import something. Let's say import to do context from to do context, right? And then when we import this to do context, we say export default let's call this state comp. Okay, let's call it a to do state. Export default to do state. Right, so it has to return something, right? Normal thing to do is that it returns something. So we want it to return. What will it return? I want it to return this component that we just imported, right? So this component we just imported to do context, but not just to do context dot provider, right? Because this guy is the provider of our context. Now this might be a little bit confusing, but in our context, somebody provides this context, and that person is this guy here. It provides our context, right? This is where we declared our context and we exported it. Okay, so it is our provider, right? So this is our context providing component. Every other component that is going to make use of this provider is the consumer, right? Let's keep going. You're going to get this along the way, I believe. So next thing I need to do is to cover this. Now let us leave this for now. We're going to come back here. All right. So now that we have this, okay, the next thing we need to do is that we need to use this context right now to wrap our entire application, because every component in this application is supposed to have access to this context here. And in order for this to happen, we need to make it possible that every component in this application has access to this context here. So to do that, we have to go to our index.js, and what we have to do there now is, of course, you see how we, if you watched our tutorial when we did a router, right? You see the way we wrapped everything with the browser router, because every part of this application is going to make use of this router. So we use it to wrap our every of our application. So we use it to wrap our app. That's the same thing that we're going to do here. All right. So we don't need React DOM right now. We're not doing router at the moment. So we need to import. We say import useState from --context/useState, which is right here. So what we need to do right now, we need to use this useState to wrap our app. So paste it over here and take this one off. Now every part of this application is going to have access to this. Now let us go back a little bit to what we did. First, we declared a context. We imported the context from React. We imported a context API, create context from React. And then we want to use this variable here to do context to access the features it has. And then we export this to do context. Now we created another component we call to do state, which is where we are going to manage all of our states. And then we imported the to do context, right? And here we rendered the to-do context of provider and closed it. So in between this place, you're going to have a lot of things going on, right? And here too, we're going to have a lot of things going on. But for now, let's just leave it this way. Then the next thing we need to create right now is something called action. Now, what is action? Action is the source of information to our store. The source of information. Now, I gave an example in the beginning about a restaurant, right? I liken this application, I liken use of context to a restaurant where every customer, irrespective of the number of the table where they are, irrespective of whether they are at the corner or at the center of the restaurant or at the entrance of the restaurant, no matter where they are, let's call these customers components. And each and every one of these customers want to make an order, right? And then each and every one of them can approach the desk and make their order. That is how it is. The actions are the only source of information. There's no other way the chef should know what to give to a particular customer if the customer doesn't make a demand, right? So that there's no other way. The customer must have to make a demand, make an order of what they want. That is the only way that the restaurant will know what to serve them. Now, the actions are the only source of information that the context has. So for that to happen, in this particular application right now, there are demands that this app is going to make. Oh, our app is broken due to some of the code we've written. The demand that this app is going to make is that, first of all, it's going to demand to add to do, right? When we click on to do, that is, we expect that one thing or the other should happen, right? And then the next action it should do is that it should be able to delete to do, and another action it should take to be able to toggle to do. This is basically what this application does, right? So the only thing that this application does is to add to do, to delete to do, to toggle to do. So these are the only three actions, the only three requests that this application is going to be making. That means these are our actions. What do? We create action. Let's call it to do action.js. So let us say this to do action. Let's create a variable. This is how to do it. Create a variable const like this, add to do equal to add to do like this. So this is how to create your actions, and say const delete to do delete to do. This is easy, right? So this is basically how you create your actions anyway. So say const to go to do, and then to go to do. So but that's not enough, we have to export them. If not, we can't access them. So we need to export these variables so we can accept it, so we can access them. Say export and say export. Just like this. So we are done with our to do actions. Now what we need to do right here is we need to close this. We are done with these two. So we need to do state in this particular place right now. We need to import these actions, right? So we import add to do all right. So we have it. Now the next thing we need right now is we need something called a dispatch. Now what does dispatch do? Let us go back to our example. When we say, so when these customers, the components, make demand on the shelf or on the counter, right? When the food is ready, what would the restaurant do? They dispatch it. They give it to a waiter, or the customer will come and take it himself. Whatever method it is they use, they need to dispatch the service, right? That is like what the dispatch do. The dispatch disperses the service. We need to create a dispatch that is going to add to do. Then we are going to create a dispatch that every time we activate it, it deletes the to do, and then we do the same thing for toggle, right? So how do you think we do this? We just create a function, and we call this function add to do. Add to do is a function, of course. The next thing we need to do is we use the dispatch. The dispatch function is a function. It's a function, but then we have to destructure it, and then inside of it we have type. So what type of instruction should this guy dispatch? Add to do. Just like that. All right, add to do. Now let us do another one for delete to do. Of course, it's a function, and then we want it to dispatch something for us. What's it going to dispatch? What type of information is it going to dispatch? Delete to do. Now we have to do the same thing. We have to do the same thing for toggle to do. say toggle to do. Now that we have this, what we need to do is that we need to pass a value to our context, because this is like the guy we use to wrap. This is our provider, right? This is our context provider. So anything we are doing here, we have to pass it here somehow. So that way, every part of our application we receive it and be able to, use the functions that we're declaring here. So that means our provider here needs to have values. So we pass an attribute called value, and this value is going to be equal to curly bracket here. So we add something, but before we do this, it means that we need to add props here. If you remember when we did props, so this context is going to have values, and that value is props dot delete to do, props dot add to do, or we can just take entire thing off entirely, just destructure it. So we have delete to do, comma add to do, comma toggle to do. Yeah, this is basically it. And then we have something else we need to do before we continue. Before we make use of the dispatch, we need to first of all declare it first, right? We need to first of all declare it, and how we do that is by making use of something called reducer. Let us go back to our restaurant example. In the restaurant, the reducer is like the chef who prepares the food, like or the person who serves the food, or the kitchen where the food happens. If I make a request for rice and stew, in Nigeria we eat rice and stew a lot, right? The rice and stew is not going to fall from the sky. Somebody has to prepare it, or if it's already prepared, somebody has to serve it. Somebody has to dish it out from the cooler or from the pot or something, and then I, the customer, will be able to eat. That guy in this application is called the reducer. The reducer solves the problem. The reducer manages the situation. It's like the real guy who handles the entire thing. And then when he's done handling it, he gives it to dispatch. He gives, he starts, he or she gives it to the dispatch or to the whoever guy who supplies this order to the customer now. So to make this happen, we need to import useReducer from React, right? We need to import useReducer from React. Now that we have imported the useReducer from React, we need to create our reducer now, our reducer component. Where are we going to cook this food? Where is the chef going to prepare this food, or where is the chef going to dish out this food from? That is where we are going to run a lot of codes, right? All this dispatch here, something is going to, now example, when we say dispatch to do or dispatch type add to do, there is somebody who cooks this food, who prepares this meal, and then pass it to this dispatch guy, and then this dispatch guy simply dispatches it into our context. And now that it is in our context, right, that context is now in this to-do state, and this to-do state, we simply have to pass it to every part of our application. That's actually what we're trying to do. Now, let us create that kitchen. I really hope you understand what I'm saying, but if you don't understand what I'm saying, please feel free to pause, go back again, and start all over. If you understand this topic, I want you to beat your chest. You have understood React. I'm promising you this. You have understood React. Every other topic is going to be simpler from here. Now, that's how it happened with me. And I actually think it will happen with you the same way too. Once you can crack this topic, Context API or Redux, you have really, or you can now say that you understand React. Every other thing will become easier from here. Now, let us create our kitchen, the guy who cooks the food. So let's call it to do reducer. reducer.js. Now in this place, what we need to do here is, first of all, we have to import those to-dos again, sorry, those actions again, right? So add, delete, to do, toggle, to do. Okay, so since we have done this, next thing we need to do here is to say export default function. Let's call this function to do reducer. Reducer, this is our chef, right? And now this guy here has state and one is action. The state, we don't know what state is, right? The state is what it uses to, let me say, to store whatever it has done, right? I have to accept two parameters. One is state and the other one is action. Right? So when we say, what we now do is we use switch. We all know the switch processes in JavaScript. In JavaScript, if you don't remember this topic, please, you can go ahead and you can use W3 schools to refresh it. So, you know, expression, and then we list the cases. So that is what we're going to do right now. So we're going to switch cases, right? Like this. We say switch action dot type. Now let us go back to this file here. Now do you remember when we said function delete to do, and whenever this function is called, we want it to dispatch this process. This process, what type? Delete to do. And this particular one dispatches this process add to do, right? So what type? Add to do. So this type here is what we're making use of here. So when we say action.type, then we're saying action type, right? Which is this type here. So we now say, so this switch accepts action. So it's switch, we say action.type. Now after switch, what we need to have right now is cases. So when the case is add to do, right, we want you to run the following. So we say return, not like this, want it to return the following code. Now let us go back a little bit to the example I gave. I told you guys that this is the guy that does the cooking, right? So every time the customer says give me rice, let's use add to do as rice. So give me or add rice. Say the case is the customer comes to the counter and tells the chef or the guy in charge, add rice. Now, and then the customer goes back to sit down. Now, this guy, this reducer guy, the chef or the guy serving the food, does something spectacular. He has to dish the rice. Now, or have to prepare the rice, or have to get the rice ready. And when he gets the rice ready, it now passes it to the dispatch guy who serves the customer. Now, this example is going to help you, right? So this is why I'm repeating it, is so that every time you think about context API, remember the restaurant example. Now, this restaurant example is the example I formed in my head when I was learning context, and it was shocking. I had to break it down, right? I have to convince myself that I'm in a restaurant. So that was how I was able to learn it, and that's how I'm teaching it like this. Okay, so I hope you follow me. All right. Now, what do we need to do? So we tell this guy, I say, when the case is hard to do, everything that this state already has, and everything that the list already has, should be stored, right? It should be there. everything we already have in this state here should still be there, right? Don't delete it, don't replace it. And then you now add the following. In addition to everything we already have in this state, do the following. Okay, let's call it to-dos. Do the following, right? Add this particular item called to-dos, and that item should contain the following. Whatever the item already has, state dot to-dos, comma, action dot payload. Now I'm going to explain this as much as I can. Now this is what we're doing. We say when it is time to, when the case is to do, whatever this state already has, count it, right? Don't delete it. It should be part of this. And then there should be another item, and this item is called to-dos. So we gave it this name, apparently. And then we'll say whatever this item already has, that is state of to-dos, that is ... state of to-dos. I'm sure you know what this is in JavaScript, comma, action.payload. Now action.payload is the new to-do now. All right, the action.payload is the new to-do. Now that brings us to what we call payload. Payload is payload is more like the new instruction. In our state right here now, we are going to add payload. So what type of information should we run this code for? It is add to do, and the payload is to do. You just call it to do. That means this function here is going to accept a parameter to do. So every time this function runs, it is expecting something. It is expecting an instruction. Now, and how will it know this instruction? What is the what will it use to identify this instruction? We call that in to do. Now, there are other times when you're going to use something else. All right. Now, come with me. Let's keep going. You're going to understand payload more in a very short time. I think at this point we have our add to do ready. Right? We have our add to do ready. Now that we have created our useReducer, now let us go back here and do something right here. Now what we need to do, so we need to initiate our reducer, the reducer that we imported here. We need to now initiate it. So we say this reducer contains state and dispatch, the dispatch that we have here. All right, and then equal to useReducer is a function. Then it's going to accept two parameters. One of the parameters it's going to accept is this parameter here, to do reducer. So let us import it. So we call it, so we have to say import to do reducer from to do reducer. So it's going to accept this function that, you remember we exported it, is export default to do reducer. So we say, sorry, so it should accept to do reducer, and then it should have initial value. Remember, this is a state, right? So just like you declare your use state, if you remember use state, we have a state and then we have an action, all right, through which the changes can be made on the state. That is almost the same thing we have here in this particular, that's almost the same thing we have in the reducer. So we have in the reducer, we have the state itself, and then we have the dispatch, right? And then this dispatch, and then it accepts values. One of it is the reducer function, where the kitchen, the guy that runs the entire thing, so it has to accept that function, and then it has to accept an initial value for this particular state here. Now this state here now, we need to declare it, right? So let's declare it somewhere. Okay, let me just declare it at the beginning here. So that state, we have to call it const initial value equal to, or let's call this initial state. So let's call this initial state as well. Yeah, so initial state should be equal to to-dos. So it is an object and it contains to-dos, and to-dos is simply an array. It's going to contain an ID, and then because every to-do item is supposed to have an ID, right? So every to-do item, every time I add a to-do item, our application should automatically assign an ID to it. So it should have an ID, and then it should contain a text. That means the value of our to-do, and it's going to contain toggle value, right? That means whether on or off. So it should be able to contain the value of the toggle. Okay. Now, so let me explain a little bit more. Now, our to-do is an array, and this array, every item in this array has an ID. It has a text, obviously, the text that we just type in our to-do, and it has a toggle value, whether on or off. So every item is going to contain these three things. All right. So that is what this guy here is going to contain, basically. So we call it to-dos, and since we call it to-dos here, it has to be to-dos here. So if you remember, so if we are using to-do or anything we are using here, that means that should be the same thing in this place. All right. So I think we have already handled so we just handled the add to do. All right. Normally we're supposed to add break, but we are dealing with useReducer and return and all of that. So it adds the break on its own. All right. So when the case is toggle to do, this is what we want you to do. We want you to return the following: every value of the state already, and then to-dos should have the following: state state.todos dot map. So we want you to map into the to-do and map into the to-do, and every item in the to-do, let's call it to-do item, or let's just call it item. Let's just call it to-do, right? In our to-do, we want you to find where to-do ID is equal to action.payload. So if the to-do ID is equal to action.payload, we want you to do the following: everything the to-do has already, and then we should have an item called complete. In this case toggle, right? In this particular place, I said everything the state has, right, is valid. So add every item in the state already, and then in our to-dos, state.todos.map. So map into our to-dos, and for every to-do item, if the to-do ID is equal to action.payload, right, and the payload is like the information, right? The information we are presenting to this toggle case. And if it exists, run the following code. All right. So the complete item of that object should be turned upside down. That means if it is on, it should be turned to off, and if it is off, it should be turned to on. If it does not exist, that means if this is not true, just return the to-do item the way it is. That means do nothing. All right. So that is what we just did here. And then the next thing we need to do right now is we need to create another case, and then we'll call this case. Oh, but we're not done with this, right? This action.payload is not yet defined. So let us come over here, the toggle to do, the payload, right? You have a payload, and that payload, we shall call it to do ID, right? The to do ID. All right. So that means this guy is going to accept a parameter called to do ID. So when we want to toggle, when we have completed a particular task, when we've completed a particular to do or task, so we want to toggle it, right, to mark that we have completed that task. There might be up to 10 items in that list. How will our application know which particular item to toggle? It is through the ID. So we are going to pass an ID to this particular guy. That is the payload, the information we are going to pass to it, the information which it will use to know where to deliver this food or who to deliver this to. That is what the payload is like, right? It's our latest information, right, through which the reducer knows where to direct the action. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? So that is what our payload is. So the same thing applies to case delete to do, semicolon, and we want it to return every other item in the list. And then in the to do's, so we'll say state dot to do's dot filter, if you remember the filter function in JavaScript, and then we want it to represent every item in this thing with to do, and then for every item find where to do.id, and then action dot payload. So the filter takes off any item that matches, that the ID matches this particular ID here, any to do item that have a matching ID with the payload, right, of the delete to do. And we need to pass the payload here, so we'll say you should use the ID to know where to. So the payload remains alright. That's the last thing in our list. So that's the last action in our list. So we say default return state. Okay, there's an error somewhere. Okay, I didn't put this. Sorry. I think that solves it. Yes. All right. So that should be all for our reducer, and let us check to do state. Okay, so the next thing we need to do right now is right, so here we have our to-dos here. We need to add it here, and then it should contain state dot to-dos, comma. All right, so I think that should be it. And no, this place is going to contain children, right? So it should contain props dot children. If you remember when we did this topic in previous classes, so this place should contain children, since we are right. I don't know if we left anything behind. I don't think so. Initial state to dos, yeah, and then we have our to dos in the value, and it represents state dot to dos. That should be all. Okay, so let us go back and apply this. Let us apply this and be sure it works. Okay, let us open our to do input, right, and let us run everything. So first of all, we import a state. Of course, you know how we manage text boxes, forms in React, so we need a state to hold the value of the form. Use state from React. And then another thing we need to import to be able to make use of our context is we need to import use context. Remember, we imported create context the first time. Now we're importing use context. That's how it is. And then we import our we import our to do context from context / to do context. We say const. So let us call this text box to do input, comma, and then we say set to do input. Use state initial value empty. So this is for our text box. So here so on change we say now we have let's go back here. Now we have a provider to do context provider, right? And this provider is going to provide this entire application, every component in this application, with all of these components, right? It's going to the dispatch, the function toggle to do, the delete to do, everything, the state is going to dispatch all of this, going to send all of this throughout this application. That means every component can now access it. All right. Now that brings us back to the restaurant example we are making once again. So every customer now have access to their food, right? The guy in the kitchen has finished cooking, passed it to the dispatch guys, and here is everybody's food. All right. So some people need the toggle to do, some people need the add to do, some people need to delete to do. Whichever one it is you need, the guy has made it available, right? So what do we need to do right now? We need to const, we say, having imported to do context, we now have to say const. What we need to do here is, well, the one we need here is add to do, right? So we say add to do is equal to use context. Remember, we already imported that. Use context, and then this context is going to accept a value, and that value is to do context, this one right here, right? So we're going to accept this. Now let us go back to our this particular place. Remember that this function add to do is expecting a payload, right? A payload called to do, or something that is going to is expecting an information share, a payload, right? And this payload is what we did our programming with. Okay, so what we enter into this text box is now this payload. So every time we add it, the useReducer, where is that guy, is going to ensure that everything we have in this list exists still, and then this guy here is going to be added in. Is going to be added in our to do array. All right, so what we do now is we now have to use it and say const new to do, right? Let's call it const new to do is equal to, so this should be kind of it should be an object, right? And this object is going to accept an ID, it's going to accept a text, it's going to accept the toggle state. So let us call it complete. Now, why are we using complete? Remember that in our reducer we say to do.complete, right? So we example example in the toggle to do case, we told our application that look out for this item, this object item, right, and perform this function here. So we can't use a different thing. Whatever it is we use here is what we are going to use in this particular place, because this is what we're going to pass into our array. All right, so the ID, we need to give this guy every item. Now it's supposed to have an ID, right? So let's create one ID. Let's create one. For now, let's just use math dot random. So generates random number and uses it as our state. So for text, the text is going to be this guy here, to do inputs, right? And then the complete, at the first time when we are adding when we are just adding this particular to do item, for now the complete state or the toggle state should be false. Work with me. All right, so the next thing we need to do right now, we need to submit something. So let's create a function and call it on. So first thing we need to do is we need to ensure that our form doesn't refresh. So we say e.prevent default. This guy here ensures our form doesn't refresh, right? I'm sure you remember this. So on submit handler, every time once we click the add button or the submit button, what we need to do is we just want this add to do here to simply accept this guy, this function here, this this object variable as the parameter, right? Is expecting. And then when it's done doing this, it should just want it to just make our text box empty again, right? And then okay, let's check this. Let's check something. Okay, so we say on submit handler. Okay, all right, let's try this. Okay, but let's try this. So when let's enter something here, let's say make my bed. Okay, we can't see what we've done because this guy here is still in a very still in mechanical form. So we have to do something here. Okay, so let awesome. All right, but okay, maybe we can do this. Let's do it like this. Let's add. Okay, we have to-dos, right? So let's bring in to-dos. Let's bring in to-dos, comma, right? So console log to-dos, right? So let's check this out. I don't know, neck. Okay, I need to fix the bug in my code by 10 a.m. All right, let's check this. All right, we have something. Okay, the first one we entered is there, right? So we have the ID, something text, make my bed, complete, false. Then here is the second one we just entered, fix the bug in my code by 10 a.m. and then the complete is still false. So our code is working. We only need to find a way to make it display right here. Okay, so the issue here is that if this text box is empty right now, so if I click to do, let's check. Now we have 3 items, so this guy here is still entered and the text is empty, right? So we don't want that, so let's just do something right here. Let's say let's do something right there. So it's just simple code. If to do input is equal to empty, right? Alert text box is empty, enter value. Else run this entire thing here. Alright, let's check it out now. Alright, so we can no longer do that until we enter something. Alright, so that solves it. Let us keep moving forward. So let's do something here. The to-do list, right? Now this to-do list renders the to-do item, right? Now what we need to do right here is we need to also import the so what we do next is we need to bring in all of our context values. So we have to-dos, we have delete, to do, we have toggle, use context, want this use context to accept this guy. So all right, so we have these things imported. Now this is where it gets interesting, right? We have to do item here, and this item is right here. It just contains to do item, right? You can see the paragraph has hard coded to do item. The delete button has no function in them. That is why every time we add an item here, it doesn't display here. Instead, it displays in our console. So what we have to do right now is that our to-do array contains 3 items right now. That is, if you add this particular one, if you add the one that is empty, making it 3 items, right? So we have an array right now called to-dos, right? So to-dos.map, right? So we need to map into this particular array now that has 3 items already, and every time we have an item, right, every item in this array should be represented by to do, or let's call it item. We use to do a lot. So every time there's an item, we want this to render to do item to render. Every time there's an item in this particular application, every time we add an item, we want this to do item to render, right? And when it renders, it should have the following props. Let's give it a key. It should have a key to do .id. It should have ID. Sorry, it should have a text. What am I doing? The text should be to do .text. It should have complete state, which should be to do dot. What am I saying to do? Oh, we're using item. I'm using to do. Sorry. Item.id. Item.text. Item dot complete. And then for the buttons, let's say delete. So because this is a button, right, it's clickable, right? So it should be like this. Every time we click on this, we want the following: delete to do. So this particular delete to do here is going to run, right? But remember that this function, in this particular place, this function is expecting a parameter, right? It's expecting an ID. It is with this ID that it should be able to, with this ID, it will now be able to run this code here, because it's going to look for where to do.id is equal to the action.payload, and the action.payload in this case is whatever is the ID of this item, right? So it's going to take that item off the list. All right, so we need to pass item.id as parameter now. All right, and then we have Togo. Our Togo is going to run a function, a back function. We call it Togo to do, and this Togo to do is also expecting a parameter item.id. So with this ID, it will know which item to delete, because if not, it will just delete everything, right? So it will delete a particular, it will delete only a particular item, only where the ID is equal to the payload. Okay, so what else? Okay, so yeah, that should be all. Okay, now that we have done this, to do item now needs to accept. Now this is more like we're making use of a lot of things that we discussed at the beginning of this course. We talked about state, we talked about props, we talked about mapping. It's like in this particular application right now we are building, in this to do application, it's like we are using every single thing that we have mentioned. Okay, but that's actually how it is, right? Okay, so what we need to do now is we have to come over here. We can see this item here still have the hard-coded values. Let's check it out. You see, instead of displaying the real items we have in our to-dos array, is displaying to do item, to do item, to do item multiple times. That is because we have 3 items here, right? We have 3 items in the array, and we already told it for every item display to do item. So the to do item stuff is displayed 3 times. Okay, so in order to display the individual items, we need to accept props here. Of course, you remember what we did then, and this particular place we are going to now say props.text, right? And then the button we are going to say on click. This is the delete button, right? So on click props.delete, and this particular one on click props.toggle. prof.toggle. So what else? Okay, so we have one empty one, and then the one that say make my bed, and the one that say fix the bug in my code by 10 a.m. and we can delete this. See that? So we have 2 left, right? We have 2 left, so we can also delete this. But see, we can also toggle. So when we toggle it, it becomes, but you can see nothing is happening, nothing shows. We want, when we toggle this, we want this particular one to change a particular, we change a different color, right? So the color of this one should be green when we have completed it. So we have completed this task, we click toggle, it turns green. So to do that, we simply need to do something in our code right here. And so in this particular class, this is the class covering the paragraphs, right? So I'm going to say something. You know what, let's take off these props here and just destructure this. Let's destructure it so that everything will be delete, toggle, complete. Yes, so we don't need all of this props.stuff, so we just leave it like this. Let's call this item delete. Let's call this item delete. So we'll call it item delete. All right, so that means in this particular place we are going to call this item delete. I think everybody's happy now, right? So React is saying I can't use delete as something, so probably it's a reserved word or something. All right, so in this particular place I'm going to say style, right? Say style color should be, so before we give this guy color, we should check if complete is true, and if complete is true, the color should be green, and else should be, it will have the original color, right? So let's check it out now. So excuse me, complete, yeah. So let's check it. Oh, good. You remember I clicked the toggle button before, so if I click it again, it becomes white. That means if I click green, I have done it. So let me add another one, and I'll say create a new, oh, I don't need this, right? I don't need this. The console is doing something. I think let me just take this off. There's a place I told it to show the console, so the console, every time I click a button, the console is doing something. Yeah, console.log to do, so I don't need that anymore. So yeah, clear this. All right, so create new tutorial by 6 p.m. So I'm gonna add it, and I can delete it. I don't want to do it anymore. I can toggle it. I can delete it now. Okay, let's say make my son a new shirt. I don't know how to make shirts. Right, make my son a new shirt. All right, it's added. Well, this is just a very simple one, and we have used it to tackle the context API topic. One more thing, let's check something I just noticed. Here we said when the to-do is added, our to-do input, which is the text box, should be empty. I don't think that is happening at the moment. Let's check something. Oh, okay, I don't need this anymore. I don't need these to-dos here anymore. So all right, let's check. Make my son a new shirt is still in the text box. That's not what we want. So why is that happening? Oh, okay. Let's add value here. To do inputs. Yeah, that's the text box. So let's check it out again. I think that solves it now. Alright, and we can toggle this. Alright, so we've practically come to the end of this tutorial. If you like what I'm doing here, please feel free to subscribe to this channel. Let us grow this community. Tell people about this channel, share the videos, like, subscribe, comment, and I think that's just where we say goodbye for today. Thank you and see you next time.